My name is Dr. Andrew Dean. I'm the Vice President of Research and Innovation here at Lakehead University. Thank you for joining us today to begin this panel discussion. I would like to acknowledge the original custodians of this land and pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the cultures, and the hopes of Indigenous people. I'd also like to recognize that our Thunder Bay campus is on the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. In Aurelia, Lakehead University resides on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe people and of the Rama First Nation. We also acknowledge the history that many nations hold in this area and look forward to respectful relations with the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in the spirit of reconciliation. Indigenous communities have and continue to be active leaders for climate change action. I encourage you to visit the Indigenous Climate Action Network site. There you will be able to find a number of articles about Indigenous-led projects. For many years, Indigenous people have advanced and advocated for some of the strongest climate policies and actions rooted in their rights, language, culture, and identities. I now would like to invite the moderator, Dr. Ellen Field from the Faculty of Education at Lakehead University Aurelia campus to open the session.
Thanks, Dr. Dean. Welcome everyone who's tuning in today. This academic year was declared by Lakehead a year of climate action, and it's wonderful that research and innovation is also focusing on planetary stewardship. There's a lot of initiatives in terms of the year of education that have been happening across our campuses as our university continues to engage in climate action. Today, we are so lucky and fortunate to have Seth Klein in conversation with 3 youth climate leaders to consider perspectives on climate action today. So I will first introduce everyone and then give you the layout of how this morning's going to go. So Seth Klein is the team lead and director of strategy of the Climate Emergency Unit, which is a 5-year project of the David Suzuki Institute. Previously, Seth served for 22 years as the founding British Columbia director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, a public policy research institute committed to social, economic, and environmental justice. He's the author of A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, and it was published back in 2020. And he also writes a regular column for the National Observer. Blythe Wieclawek, who maybe Blythe you can wave, thanks, is the president of the Sustainable Aurelia Youth Council. She's 16 years old and is in grade 11 at Twin Lakes Secondary School. So if you're at Twin Lakes, you can cheer right now. Located in Aurelia. She grew up in an environmentally conscious home and learned the importance of prioritizing the health of the planet very early. After participating in elementary school green teams, when she entered high school, she joined the Sustainable Aurelia Youth Council to get further involved in youth-led environmental initiatives. She now leads the group of over 20 members and is an advocate for youth voices and the environment on the community and municipal levels. Next, we have Anjelina Pathak, so give us a wave, Anjelina, is an active community member, a high school student, and a member of the Friday for Future Thunder Bay. She enjoys sharing her knowledge about the significance of climate change to elementary and middle school students and how together we can make a difference. And next we have Chloe Nguyen, who is a 10th grade student at Windermere Secondary School in Vancouver. So I hope Windermere, you can hear the chants down your hallway, Chloe, right now. She has a passion for making a positive difference in her community. She's been a climate activist for a couple of years and is currently Climate Education Reform BC, which is also called CERBS, social media coordinator. She likes to live her life by the motto, leave it better than when you found it. And this includes the earth we walk on. So thanks Seth and the youth panelists for attending today. So how this is going to work first is we're going to watch a video and then each speaker is going to have some time to sort of give their perspective. And then we will open the floor for questions and answers. So if while you're listening to the various panelists speak, you'd like to ask a question, please do so in the Q&A, and at the end we'll get to those. So the first thing we're going to do is watch a short film that Seth has created called 4 Hopeful Lessons from World War II.
There is no home in Canada, no family, and no individual whose fortunes and freedoms are not bound up in the present struggle.
That's Prime Minister Mackenzie King speaking to Canadians at the outset of the Second World War. Today, another existential threat looms over us, the climate emergency. But don't worry, this is a hopeful video about what it would look like to unite to rapidly and dramatically lower our emissions and give future generations a fighting chance for a good life on a safer, more equitable planet. Impossible? Tell that to those who rallied in the face of fascism 80 years ago. In just a few years, Canada transformed our entire economy to meet the challenge and produce what was required. By the time victory was declared, we'd manufactured more military vehicles than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. Compare that to the current emergency. Here's Canada's greenhouse gas emissions since we committed to cutting them. And here's where we now urgently need to go. So what needs to happen here to truly assume our generation's calling to get off fossil fuels? World War II gives us 4 markers for when a government has genuinely shifted into emergency mode. Marker number 1, it spends what it takes to win. When pressed about the unprecedented 10-fold increase in government spending, the minister overseeing Canada's World War II military production, C.D. Howe, famously replied, "If we lose the war, nothing will matter."
This is the largest economic program in Canada's history.
In the face of the COVID pandemic, Canada's governments have spent what was required. Deficits be damned.
Canada hasn't seen this type of civic mobilization since the Second World War.
It turns out, when our governments recognize an emergency, the money is there. But public spending on climate action pales in comparison. That needs to be ramped up, way up. Just like in 1939, when Canada's military started from a base of virtually nothing.
The permanent forces in the 30s were pathetically small and ill-equipped. The Army had only 4,000 men and 2 tanks.
Enter our second marker for taking emergencies seriously. The government creates new economic institutions to get the job done. Once World War II was declared, Canadians pumped out a volume of military equipment that is simply mind-blowing. 800,000 military vehicles, over 700 ships, and 16,000 military aircraft, creating the 4th largest air force in the world at the time. The government established 28 crown corporations, public enterprises purpose-built to meet the task at hand. To get off fossil fuels, we'll need a massive number of heat pumps, solar arrays, wind farms, insulation manufacturers, electric buses, and other sustainable technologies. And we'll need a new generation of public corporations to build and deploy them. Marker number 3, government shift from voluntary policies to mandatory measures. In World War II, the transformation of our economy wasn't voluntary, it was required. But on climate, we encourage change, we incentivize change, we offer rebates, we send price signals. But what we have decidedly not done is require change. By next year, no new buildings should be heated with fossil fuels. We should immediately ban the advertising of fossil fuel vehicles at gas stations, just like we did with cigarettes. And by 2025, it should be illegal to sell new combustion-powered vehicles. Which leads to marker number 4. The government tells the truth about the severity of the crisis and the measures necessary to combat it.
I appeal to my fellow Canadians to unite in a national effort to save from destruction all that makes life itself worth living, and to preserve for future generations those liberties and institutions which others have bequeathed to us.
The wartime leaders that led us to victory were forthright about the gravity of the crisis, yet still managed to impart hope. Their voices amplified by journalists, artists, and entertainers who knew what side of history they wanted to be on. In the face of the climate emergency, though, we have seen little of this consistency and coherence. Worse yet, our governments send contradictory messages every time they approve new fossil fuel infrastructure.
We're on our way to getting 3 new pipeline projects underway, which will help connect Canada's oil patch with energy markets around the world.
We need leaders to not just acknowledge the climate emergency, but to speak and act like it's a damn emergency. 4 markers of emergency mode. During the Second World War, The Canadian government hit all of them, big time. But on climate, we're 0 for 4.
In the months to come, these veterans must find their places in the life of Canada.
One last wartime lesson. Every great mobilization comes with a pledge to leave no one behind, that life after the fight will be brighter and more just.
A young country on the march needs the energies and devotion of all her fighting men and women. For full employment, jobs all round, is the post-war goal of every government.
The climate mobilization must include a jobs guarantee for everyone who wants one, and a just transition for all those whose livelihoods are tied to fossil fuels or who live on the front lines of the climate crisis, as part of an overarching commitment to tackling inequality. That's how we create common purpose. That's how we get everyone on the bus. This is the task of our lives, our generational opportunity to do something grand together. It's time to press our leaders into service. It's time to mobilize for the climate emergency.
Thanks, Seth, for your willingness to share that awesome video and also provide a really powerful frame for our conversation this morning. So why don't we open it up? Seth, you'll go first, and I've asked each panelist to respond to what they think the most important things are for young people to be thinking about or acting in terms of climate action and leadership. So we'll go with you first, Seth.
Great, thank you, Ellen, and good afternoon to all of you. Thanks for joining us. I'm really happy to be doing this with this fantastic panel. And I'm joining you, as Chloe is, from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, otherwise known as Vancouver. I hope you like the video. So we produced it last year, and it seeks to capture the emergency framework that I and my team with the Climate Emergency Unit are trying to employ. And for those of you in Thunder Bay, by the way, you should know that when you hear about that amazing story of our wartime production, your city actually had a special role in that story. C.D. Howe, who was the minister who oversaw all of that production, and who I quote in the video there, this remarkable fellow who was so critical to all of that, he was for 22 years the member of parliament for what is now Thunder Bay. And also the Cancar company plant in what is now Thunder Bay what landed the contract to build the Hawker Hurricane fighter planes, which was a key piece of the war. And all of this production was actually under the direction of Canada's first female aeronautical engineer, a woman named Elsie McGill. She became something of a national superstar. They even had a comic about her. And by the end of the war, that plant in your city had produced 1,450 planes. So this past year, I think, has really been one of our reckoning with the climate emergency, especially in mine and Chloe's province of British Columbia, the heat domes, the floods, the fires. I think a lot of us are really wrestling with growing feelings of fear and anxiety as we witness these unfolding disasters. We do indeed confront an emergency. There's no denying that. And I feel for your generation. If we fail to act quickly, then over the course of the coming decades, things get very grim. A world that's unlivable and catastrophic for many, deeply uncomfortable and disruptive for all others, quite possibly ungovernable. An ecological crisis, but just as equally a human and social justice crisis and a civilizational threat. But for all of you who feel like me, deeply anxious about that, I want to offer you two reflections from my study of emergencies. So this World War II study and the experience we've all had in the last 2 years with the pandemic and now the climate emergency. There are two observations that I think provide some hope, okay? The first is this: all emergencies start with a period of denial, this awkward period of denial that we're in right now, right? But second, my second observation is that at some point, some magical combination occurs of events and leadership that shift the popular thinking and move us into emergency mode. And when that happens, these emergencies, once they're recognized as emergencies, transform us. They transform our society, our relationships, our economy, our leaders, and things then become possible at a speed and a scale that few of us would have predicted. And that time is coming. And you are all starting your adulthood on the cusp of what is going to be an extraordinary transformation that's coming. It's going to be wild to witness, and better yet, to be a part of it. When I think about the role of young people, I see so many parallels between the war story and the present climate emergency. You know, in both cases, it was and is countless young people mobilizing in defense of our collective future. In the Second World War, from a population of about 11 million Canadians at the time, over 1 million Canadians enlisted for military service. I mean, that's remarkable, right? But you know, of all of those hundreds of thousands of Canadians who went to fight overseas from all corners of the country and many ethnic backgrounds, the overriding characteristic that they had in common was their youth. 64% of them were under the age of 21. They were just a little bit older than you. And similarly, as the world now begins to confront the climate crisis, the last few years have seen this burgeoning of youth leadership and a whole new era of young people, again, mobilizing and exercising their political muscle. More than any other generational cohort, what the polling tells us is that it's young people who understand the climate crisis and want to see real action. And you see that reflected in the global sweep of Fridays for Future, global student strike events, which have changed the terrain of public opinion and political opinion. And I want to recall, you know, just a few months before the pandemic, in the fall of 2019, we had this global day of action, a youth-led global day of action, in which about 1 million Canadians took to the streets, the largest single day of protest in Canadian history, as near as I can tell. That protest had a huge impact on the federal election a few months later, or the next month, really. It changed the conversation. So young people are giving expression to the emergency. And some of you are rightly shaking up what is normal, because we must. And in the face of those who object to you striking during school time, I'd say you're proudly honoring Mark Twain's wise counsel that sometimes you can't let your schooling interfere with your education. And Ellen, do I have time to share one story out of Vancouver, or should I wait and hold that for later?
You can share and then we'll move on. Yep.
I want to tell you one story from mine and Chloe's city, because it speaks to the role of young people, even young people who aren't yet allowed to vote, although they should be. That's another topic of conversation. In January of 2019, Vancouver City Council became the first municipal government in English Canada to pass a climate emergency motion. It passed unanimously, and it's not just symbolic. That motion gave city staff 90 days to come up with a new climate plan that would dramatically ramp up the city's actions and timelines to meet the targets set out in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so as a result, Vancouver has a true climate emergency plan. It too was passed unanimously 3 months later. And it lays out bold measures like here in this city, no new buildings, as of 2 months ago, no new buildings are allowed to use fossil fuels for space and water heating. That's huge. Now, full disclosure, the Vancouver motion was led by Vancouver City Councillor Christine Boyle, who's also my wife. But here's what I want to say. Those motions passed unanimously, even though the City Council is all over the political spectrum, right? There's you never know how a vote's going to go in this city, but they passed unanimously. How did that happen? What Chris would say is that it happened because each time those votes happened, dozens of high school students skipped school. They rallied outside. They spoke before council. They filled the galleries and they watched. And they basically made it politically impossible for even the conservative councillors to vote no. They did that. This is their win. So let me close my opener with this comment for those of you who are feeling anxious about the crisis we face. Action like that and organizing is the best antidote to despair. Hope is found in the doing, acting in common cause with others in this task of our lives. Thanks.
Thanks, Seth. Lots to chew on there and think about. All right, so now let's go to Blythe Vincevic to share her perspective.
Hi, I'm Blythe. Thanks, Ellen, for the introduction. Like she said, I'm 16 years old and I go to Twin Lakes Secondary School, which is located in Aurelia, Ontario. And I'm also the president of the Sustainable Aurelia Youth Council, which is the youth sector of the Greater Sustainable Aurelia organization. I lead a group of about 20 students who are all like-minded and passionate about ensuring Aurelia does its part to tackle the climate crisis, become a climate leader, and we also prioritize teaching other young people about the crisis and empowering them to begin their own initiatives to make their communities climate resilient. So as a high school student, everyone goes through their history classes and learns about different types of emergency in Canada, world wars, global pandemics, economic crises, etc. However, that's how they're spoken of in the past. I love how this video stresses the truth and the importance of acknowledging that we are in a crisis comparable to the Second World War and that Canada has the ability to repeat history and change to combat this issue that is quite literally deciding the fate of our world. I think it's super important to think of the climate crisis as this national, international issue, and we need large-scale policies and change in order to create the magnitude of change necessary to defeat this. However, I also think that it's so important to acknowledge the smaller scale changes that we can do to do our part. I'm talking about municipal action and pressuring local municipalities to implement ambitious policy and initiatives. 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions can be dictated through municipal action, through things like waste management, urban planning and land use planning, how we supply electricity or new heat developments, public transportation, etc. It may be more difficult to create dramatic change on the national level. However, we can all do our part to revolutionize our local communities, no matter our age. It's also one of the most overlooked parts of climate action, which makes it all the more important. So that ties into some of the work that the Sustainable Aurelia Youth Council is doing. We've been continuously working with and representing youth voices on our city's climate change action plan, which they're in the process of developing. We have attended numerous calls and have protested against proposed policies that are not nearly ambitious enough. We've held rallies to raise awareness on the project, and we continue to pressure our city to create the most impactful, ambitious climate change action plan possible for the sake of youth today and for our future generations. And as well, the Youth Council is in the process of planning a day-long youth sustainability summit at Lakehead University, Aurelia campus, which will allow 200 students in our area to come together, develop their leadership skills, learn about different sustainability initiatives, and actually lead with an initiative that they can create in their own community. So we're in the process of cementing dates for this right now and working with the local school board to make it a field trip, which is super exciting. And so in conclusion, it is essential that young people understand that yes, climate change is a massive problem that must be solved now, but that there are actual ways to do this. All hope is not lost, and our country and the world has revolutionized in the past to combat massive issues like this. And so we can do it again with this one. Thanks.
Awesome, Blythe. Thanks for sharing that. And also, if you are a student in Simcoe County District School Board, think about going to that one-day workshop. So next, let's go to Anjelina Pathak, and let's hear your perspective.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm Anjelina Pathak, a representative for Fridays for Future Thunder Bay. I'm 16 years old and I go to Superior CBI. Fridays for Future Thunder Bay is a youth-led movement with approximately 10 to 12 grade 11/12 students who take on the initiative to advocate and help raise awareness for our current climate crisis. The climate emergency has been growing sporadically for the past decades, and there is more than enough evidence that demonstrates the direct correlation between the rising emergency and human activities that cause said emergencies, which is why I feel that it is important for the youth to be involved in climate activism, or at least even comprehend that there is an emergency. Because if we refuse to even comprehend that there is an emergency, then there is little to no chance of reversing the harmful impacts human activities have caused and continue to cause on the planet. So I think as youths who are advocating for not only the planet, but our future, it is easy to get demotivated, but we have to remember that there's many things that we can do to help raise awareness, and our main focus should be, or Fridays for Future's main focus is to raise advocacy, awareness, and activism regarding the climate crisis. Some examples of our leadership activities include organizing sustainable challenges that students can take part in. For example, we are currently planning a sustainable style week to encourage high school students to wear at least one sustainable item of clothing a day for a week. As well, we organize and participate in local and or global strikes. The next strike we are planning to take part in and organize in Thunder Bay is the global climate strike. Along with it, we are also taking part of a movement called Parachutes for the Planet. As well, as I mentioned before, the youths are the future. So a lot of the times Fridays for Future's main focus is to go into elementary schools and directly educate the students on how impacts of on the impacts of climate change and how they can help to prevent it from worsening. Because at the end of the day, they are the future, and without proper awareness and understanding of the destructive capabilities of climate change, they cannot move towards living a more sustainable lifestyle, because how can they be a part of the fight for change if they are unaware of what they are fighting to change? Which then, to support my point, the introduction video very well compared how much we lack in emphasizing the importance of climate change being a global emergency, because both wars and climate change are life-threatening global emergencies, yet school, one of the most influential parts of most people's lives, emphasizes so heavily on teaching students about the cause and consequences of war and the global emergencies that they have and do cause, which they should do, yet they do nothing of the same extent, or in most school curriculums, they do nothing at all to teach the youth about the destructive capabilities of climate change. So in conclusion, I think that, of course, youth should be involved in taking further initiatives to advocate for their rights, because this is our future. But I think that schools should also be joining in and starting to change or evolve how we teach our students about climate emergencies, because that is what it is, a climate emergency.
Thanks, Anjelina. Lots to chew on there as well, and I'd definitely say a lot of my research sort of supports and is in alignment with some of the claims that you've just made. So thanks for that. And so that sort of sets up as well our last speaker, Chloe, who is, I won't speak to what you're doing, but I think it's a response in terms of what we can see schools responding to in terms of the climate emergency. So Chloe.
Hello, everyone. As Ellen mentioned, I'm Chloe, and as Seth mentioned earlier, I'm calling from the unceded, stolen, and ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish peoples. Today, I want to thank Lakehead for offering me a chance to be a part of this event. Like all of you, I'm also a concerned youth about climate change. I am part of Climate Education Reform BC, a student-led organization where our campaign, Reform to Transform, advocates for an intersectional, justice-driven education system that adequately prepares students for the biggest crisis of our time. Like in the video, we noticed a lack of government mobilization to address the climate emergency, and more specifically with our campaign, the absence of attention on climate education. We want a curriculum that adequately represents the severity of the issue and that prepares current and future generations to be equipped with the knowledge to properly tackle the climate emergency. For us in SURBC, it became clear that many students from across so-called BC and Canada are not prepared to understand and mobilize against climate change. Similar to the video, we want to move from voluntary climate change education to mandated education so we can ensure that students aren't misinformed, as well as inspiring students to take action with their knowledge instead of invoking a sense of despair. So to advocate for the change we want, we have created a document of demands from the Provincial Ministry of Education called Our Needs. I can post a link to it in the chat real quick. And in this document, we outline what we think are necessary steps that must be accomplished to adequately implement a climate curriculum into our education system, many of them aligning with the markers of emergency mode. For example, our first need is that the Ministry of Education must make a public declaration and commitment to the climate emergency. This is an important stepping stone in the process, as it holds the government accountable for their future actions. We also address in our fourth need the importance of creating a curriculum that has mandatory climate justice education beyond just the sciences. Students need to know not only about the consequences to nature and humans, but also the possible solutions we can feel, so we can feel empowered to take action and not paralyzed with climate anxiety. The vision in SRBC goes beyond curriculum change. It also aims to inspire other youth to take action in any areas concerning climate change, or maybe even campaigning for your local curriculum to change. Personally, taking action and participating in my local community helped alleviate some of my climate anxiety by allowing me to feel a sense of control and influence over the outcome of our future. By learning more about the issue, we students are able to become leaders in our schools or communities and consider joining a local climate organization, club, or movement near you to contribute to the cause. And I think that this is really important for youth to take in charge and lead this movement, as we are going to be the most impacted by this in the future. We'll be living with it the longest and the future generations to come. And so the education system should be formed around its future students and what we need to know to carry on the future and live in the environment that we have.
Thanks, Chloe. I will just add to what Chloe shared with us, that BC is the only Ministry of Education that actually has a statement on climate change education. No other ministries in Canada currently do. We can see some leadership at the school board levels, and there's some school boards that have declared states of emergency, but actually BC is the only ministry that actually has set out any kind of, it's not even a full framework, they have a statement. So there's big gaps in terms of the leadership at the ministerial level in terms of setting those policy directives. And so I'm not sure, Chloe, if it's the work of SRBC that has created this policy, because I noticed that it only came forward in December of 2021. And I know you'd been in consultation with the minister for quite some time. So if that's an outcome of your work, congratulations. But we also need sort of more of a framework and other provinces to lead in this way. So thanks for that. I also just want to add before we get into the questions, and if you're listening right now and you have a question, please enter them into the Q&A. But for those of us who are adults and identify as adult allies to youth climate activists, I think it's really important for us to recognize how important it is to amplify these youth voices, but not overstretch them, and recognize ways that we can work to amplify their work, but also not ask them to do tons of menial things in order to comply with our organizational needs, because they get stretched really thin. I work with lots of youth climate activists. They are busy people, and we need to recognize youth as having really busy lives, and that so we need to work as allies and recognize their positions. So the first question I have, and I'll ask Seth first, and then I'll get other panelists to please just jump in. But from your perspective, we're sort of looking at sort of concretely, how can schools be more responsive to the climate crisis?
Yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, I would say if you're a student activist or teacher activist, use the 4 markers as a framework applied to a school or a school board, right? So when we think about, like in the video you saw, spend what it takes to win. Are our schools and school boards spending what it takes, investing to fuel swap all of our school buildings? And electrify their heating, for example? Are they changing up the food in the cafeterias in terms of sourcing what kind of food they're serving and how local they are? Are they changing up the parking and transit for the schools and with charging stations and that kind of thing? The marker around creating new institutions, I mean, this is why the work that Chloe and her colleagues are doing is so important, actually, to both that and the telling the truth piece, right? Embedding it in the curriculum the way Chloe and her colleagues are doing it, but also creating programs around the climate emergency. Like Chloe is in this program at Windermere High School in Vancouver, which is a small, they have a small cohort focused on the climate emergency. I can't tell you, like having been in this for a while, I have witnessed multiple waves of leadership, like key leaders in the Vancouver climate movement are graduates of Chloe's tiny program. A well-designed program is transforming our city, and played this instrumental role in winning the debates I mentioned. When we think about emergency, it strikes me, if you were a student in a high school student in World War II, everything about the experience of walking through those doors in the morning told you you were a student at a time of emergency. I don't think any of your schools look and feel that way today, but they should. We're there again. And I think you have a key role to play pressuring your teachers' union to take this a step further. Those of you in Ontario and in BC, but your teachers' union is still invested in fossil fuels. And there is a deep irony in that. They are effectively betting against your future by continuing to hold fossil fuel companies. And you have an important voice there to change that as well. I've spoken too much. I'll leave it at that.
Would a youth panelist like to jump in terms of concrete actions that schools can respond? Yeah, Blythe, go for it.
Yeah, I think that's something that schools could definitely do, is do more complete teaching on the subject. Because in my experience and experiences of my peers, we always end up briefly touching on the subject itself, whether it's in a history or a social science or just a general science class. But when we touch on the problem itself, we often focus on the doomsday aspects of it and just leave it at that. Like they show us, I remember being in the 3rd grade and watching a video on climate change and watching all these adorable animals that I loved when I was little, watching their habitats be destroyed and looking at plastic in the ocean, and then it shuts off. And my peers and I are just sitting on the carpet, like absolutely shocked. And then we just move on to the next subject, and then it's just done. And that was our climate change education for the year. And so I think we need to do more complete teaching on the subject, and we need to teach a more positive or inspirational side of it as well, and showcase innovative climate solutions that are taking place right now and things that students are doing right now that will inspire students to create their own change. And then with that, properly equip teachers to properly teach this and support students in the initiatives that they lead to create, like the work that you're doing, Ellen.
Thanks, Blythe. I'll just add to that in terms of what the research says. So I actually conducted an analysis of every provincial curriculum's climate change education expectation. And predominantly it does focus on the climate science and mostly on just knowledge and understanding of the climate science or human impact when we get into social studies. But very little, and I don't have the data right in front of me, focus on those solutions. And so that is the piece that is so key in terms of also that antidote that Seth was talking about, as well as getting involved. And then what Blythe, I'd like to just come back to what you said around the impact of sort of municipal engagement. There is so much happening at our municipal levels. And so if our teachers can find ways to create those projects that engage young people in solutions on that municipal level, wow, what a change, what a engaging, authentic experience. So I just wanted to echo that. Chloe or Anjelina, did you want to respond to this question, or should I go to the next question? Yeah, Chloe.
So yeah, I definitely agree with everything like Seth and Blythe mentioned about changing the curriculum. And I just wanted to share that like I also see, I guess, schools can be more responsive to it by adding those parts, because I definitely see a disparity where I'm in a leadership program that is centered around climate and environmental stewardship, and I'm able to see the disparity between my peers that are not in the program and the peers that are inside my program, and how we are taught differently on how things work. And so it really, I guess, influences our perspective on the future and what we could do. But besides changing our curriculum, I think there should also be more, schools should be fostering more of a connection to nature, because I think without that, we don't realize how humans are interwoven with nature and how much we are dependent on it for our well-being, as well as like our future and everything. And so I think closing the gap between our like what nature is and how we are in nature, I think when we close that gap, we're able to, I guess, allow students to empathize with the climate emergency more and feel like they need to take action more. And I guess it makes it more effective to teach it in the classroom by getting students more engaged with what they're learning, by also feeling that they are invested in the nature around them, as well as I guess having community events that schools can host by uplifting and supporting other climate movements, and like highlighting divestment campaigns, sharing about land protectors' work. All those are really important in this, and also starting conversations about how communities can make change. So like attending city hall meetings or letter writing. And I think that's all very important for schools to implement and I guess try to make better.
Thanks, Chloe. I'm just going to add one thing. So the research also supports that actually leadership is one of the most effective ways to engage young people in adopting pro-climate behaviors, is actually teaching those explicitly, as well as a sense of efficacy, where the knowledge and understanding in climate science or the urgency are far less effective ways to engage young people in adopting pro-climate behavior. So if you're a teacher, really think about that leadership piece. I think there's a lot to be taken, and I'd love to actually study Windermere more in depth in terms of what's happening there. But I do want to go to Anjelina, and I'm wondering, Anjelina, you spoke in your first opening comments about the Parachutes for Climate initiative, and I'm wondering if you have any other comments, but if you could also share around that specific initiative that you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. I also want to just add that I agree with everything that everybody has said about adding to the curriculum and just making sure that schools are more eco-friendly in general. But for Parachutes for the Planet is sort of based around the idea of raising awareness inside of schools for students and teachers. So we have Paul Berg, he's lending us parachutes for, so far we have 2 schools that are participating, Superior and Hammarskjöld. And the idea, sorry, this chair's really squeaky, but the idea is that on the parachutes, a group of students are going to come and basically let out their creative outlet as a way of raising awareness. So we're thinking of paintings, sayings, and like any creative outlet you have onto the parachute to raise awareness and activism for climate change. And our goal is to have that done by March 25th, so we can walk around with the parachute while we're doing our global climate strike and the Parachutes for the Planet. So that's sort of what our goal is with it.
Great, thanks.
By the way, that's Anjelina, that you've got a high school named after a former Secretary General of the United Nations. Because the current Secretary General's really doing such an incredible job of articulating some of what has to happen now. You might be able to play around with that.
Yeah, for sure.
So there has been one question asked here in the chat. What's the realistic expectation for when Canada will have 0 carbon emissions? So I'll open that up for anyone who would like to jump in.
Well, that is a thornier question than you might realize. So the federal government is currently saying that it will reduce emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030 and will be net zero by 2050. The net zero part of that is particularly fraught. because the idea is that it isn't the same as carbon zero. It's that it might be offset by technologies that try to grab carbon suck it out of the air and bury it underground. It's heavily reliant on a lot of technologies that we don't actually have yet. And I think it's much more useful actually to stay focused, as your question does, on actually hitting zero. Because the reality is we're also going to need to suck carbon out of the air in addition to getting to zero, so that we can bring accumulated carbon down to a safe level. Oh, but the last thing I would say about that is, you know, you saw in the video that all we've done is kind of flatlined our emissions as a country. We have failed to bend the curve. If you look at the federal climate policies to date, I think we are now going to start seeing the curve come down, but it's not going to be coming down at the slope that the science says we have to hit. And that's our task collectively. Our government is taking action, but they are not hitting the 4 markers. They are not in emergency mode. And until they do, we will not achieve the speed and scale of the emission reductions that's now required.
Great, thanks, Seth, for answering that. Would anyone else like to add in? I have a question. I think we're just going to get to ask one last question before we end, but I'll pause asking it unless Chloe, Anjelina, Blythe wants to respond to that one. Good, okay, great, thanks. So the last question I would like to ask each of you is just to briefly share with us what gives you hope in terms of climate change, what gives you despair, and what gives you resilience in the work that you do to keep going, and what that looks like for you. So let's start with Anjelina.
For me personally, I think I want to start with despair, because I think just seeing the lack of news surrounding and regarding how big of a deal climate change is, and how much people try to kind of just like deflect it as if it's not really that big of a problem, and how little of actions, politics, and our education system contributes to activating for climate change. But then on the flip side, I think what gives me hope is doing panels like this and meeting other youths and students who are also fighting for climate change, and seeing what a global impact and how many youths and adults and everybody's been coming together to fight for climate change. I think that's what gives me the most hope with it. And for resilience, I think it's when I'm like actively being a part of it is when I feel the most as if their change is going to happen, I'd say.
Great, thanks. Chloe.
Yeah, I would also like to say, like, to start with despair, and that like often when organizing as a youth in the climate movement, we are overlooked a lot or looked down upon as, I guess, not the same, I guess, not a valid like thought, or by, I guess, by a lot of politicians, because I've had a lot of meetings with them in the past for SIRBC, and a lot of the time our campaign is thought to be pushed aside and kind of not recognized for what it is, for all the work that we put into it. But at the same time, that gives me a sort of a hope moving forward that as students and many other youth around the world start mobilizing against climate change, that our voice is getting heard even more, and that I guess the impact that we have on our communities as youth by advocating for this, and I guess being a part of the conversation more and having a voice at the table where the large decisions are made are being seen to be, I guess, it's being more and more prevalent now that youth are being taken to the table to ask their thoughts, what their thoughts are on the issue. And so I guess that's what my hope is, that we have an impact on our community, and we have a voice, and we inspire future youth to take action alongside with us.
Thanks, Chloe. All right, Blythe.
Yeah, so I can start with the despair aspect as well. For me, that would be just the fact that when you look at what your local leaders are doing, or your provincial, national, just on every scale, looking and seeing sort of the hypocrisy between their words versus their actual actions, and seeing that right now we're not doing enough. And like we saw with this video, with our emissions soon, it could be too late. And that can cause a lot of feelings of anxiety and hopelessness within students. And so something that sort of causes me despair is that I don't want myself and all of my peers to get to sort of an apathetic stage where we just feel so overwhelmed by the negative emotions that we don't feel that we can create change. And so to combat that, the thing that gives me hope is the community of climate aware and passionate young people at my school, in my community, but also online. And you can see online how it's all over the world. And so even if you are feeling isolated in your feelings of wanting to make change or create partnerships or find a community, you can look online and see the multitude of different spaces that also provide hope for people. And in terms of resilience, I would say it's just all the small wins. And so that's another thing that municipal action is good for, is because if you can, get small things passed in your community, or even contribute in small ways to your school community, you can see more support build for the movement and see the direct impact that you have in your community. So that's definitely something that can give resilience.
Thanks, Blythe. And Seth?
Well, you all give me hope. Chloe, Anjelina, and Blythe, thank you for the work that you and your colleagues are doing. And I would say on a larger level, and as I spoke to in my opening, the youth-led action we have seen gives me hope. It's changing our politics, and it's also influencing thousands of parents to take this emergency more seriously. I also derive a lot of hope from the Indigenous-led climate action we've seen. In an era when our politics dithers and dodges on the climate emergency, we have seen an extraordinary trail of Indigenous-led actions that have blocked and slowed fossil fuel development projects and kept GHGs in the ground. And I'm grateful for it, because it's buying us time until our politics finally aligns with the science. But Ellen, this question of hope and despair is a challenging one. It's a fraught one. The truth is, any of us who follow the science, as this whole panel does, walks a razor's edge between hope and despair. We know both. We just have to be upfront about that. And we live in a time of great ambiguity. The truth is, we don't know if we're going to do what we need to do in time. I don't envy you young people watching this thing. I cut my political teeth as a teenager, a high school activist too, in the peace and disarmament movement in the 1980s. The existential threat then was the threat of global nuclear war. But it operated differently, you see, because for us, that would either happen or it wouldn't happen. Climate doesn't work that way. It's already happening, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. It's all just a matter of degrees at this point. And that's challenging, but maybe I can close with this thought. Well, so first of all, for all the young people watching, you can get on our newsletter. I shared the link. I invite you to stay active, to engage your members of parliament. You have an Ontario election happening in June. This is a moment to engage. And we've talked about how you can engage with your school boards. All of that matters. I shared in my earlier opening that, from in the war, from a population of 11 million Canadians, over 1 million of them enlisted, 64% of them under the age of 21. By the way, the voting age was only 21 then. All those young people who mobilized couldn't vote yet, which is why I would add to the list here, I've long believed all of you should vote. The voting age should be lower because it's your future at stake. But all those young people who mobilized World War II, you know what they didn't know? They didn't know if they would win. We know how their story ended, but they didn't. And there was for many of the early years of the war, it was an open question what the outcome would be. And they did it anyway. And in the process, they surprised themselves by what they were capable of accomplishing. And I think that's the spirit we need to bring to the current moment.
Thank you, Seth, for those words. My last question was very much to bring to the surface those complex climate emotions that we sometimes often in educational circles will say, you know, here's the urgency, but let's get to the hope. And it feels somewhat disingenuous because it's a complex time and the emotions are very complex. And so I think we need to find a way to be sincere in terms of our intentions when we talk to young people, that it's actually very rational to have climate anxiety right now. It is the normal response. And so if you're feeling overwhelmed, that shows that you are a person who feels and you care, and not to necessarily feel that that's something that's wrong with you. I think that's a very normal response for what's happening in the world right now. So thank you all for your sharing what you have so far and for participating. We have all kinds of schools. If you haven't had the chat open, panelists and Seth, all kinds of schools who have been trying to make connections during the chat. And so I think this is also an opportunity for school boards to find those schools, to find those champion teachers, because currently that's really where this leadership is happening with young people who are leading and with teachers who are leading. And the few administrators, but we need that stronger institutional push. So please do make those connections. I'm going to turn it over to Lita McKellar, who is our sustainability coordinator at Lakehead and who's going to share some final words for us today. So thank you.
Thank you, Ellen, and everyone on the panel. It's been really great and I've enjoyed listening to everybody. And I'd really just like to thank you all for participating in another great event of the Year of Climate Action and our Research and Innovation Week at Lakehead University. As was, actually, I don't think this was mentioned, but let me just mention it quickly. Lakehead declared this school year the Year of Climate Action. And it's really been our invitation to our community to listen, to learn, to share, and most importantly, to act on climate change. And YOCA, which is our acronym, sometimes mix it up with yoga, recognizes that climate change is amplified when we work together. And over the past year, we've really been working on building the relationships and the leadership roles that we need to sustain climate action at our university. There have been a lot of great ideas that have been born from YOCA. And I think this event today has illustrated so well the different ways that youth and schools can get involved in climate action. And our aim with the Year of Climate Action was to get as many departments and offices and individuals involved. And we know that the extent of climate impacts and our readiness to respond to those impacts requires us to think across disciplines. So likewise, and as I think was discussed today, and I would like to echo, one way high schools can get involved outside, of modeling operational changes is to integrate climate change across courses, across subjects, like was said, not just the sciences, but in all the other subjects, so that the youth of today are well informed to be the climate leaders of tomorrow. And I'll just add that I think millennials and younger generations has often sort of been told the future's on us, and our generation's unsolicited job is sort of to solve this problem. And sometimes that can feel like a heavy burden, but in a different light, as author and environmentalist Paul Hawkins said, you couldn't ask for a better boss than the planet, and sometimes I hold that dear. I do just want to take a moment to recognize the climate leadership that our panelists and youth across the world have shown. So from Greta Thunberg, who sat alone in front of Swedish Parliament several years ago and inspired climate strikes across the world, to water protector Autumn Peltier from Wieclawek First Nation, who stood up against world leaders to speak out for First Nations living under boil water advisories, and so much more. And to the youth on this panel today, I think you have shown time and again and unapologetically demanded radical and transformative climate action. And so often, speaking an uncomfortable truth that many of us need to hear, but too often deny. And I just want to say that youth lead the way, despite, as has been mentioned today, dealing with the many complex and challenging emotions that climate change so often instills in us. And I just extend my gratitude to all the youth and the climate activists everywhere doing this work. You certainly give me hope, and I hope that we can meet again in this journey. With that, I thank everyone for attending today, and I'm so pleased that the high schools were able to attend, and we will try to send some links out after with the things we referenced today, and I wish you a wonderful afternoon.